My brother Dale walked into the Cascade Range in the summer of 1968 and never came back out. That's the short version. The long version is what I've been carrying for 56 years, and I'm going to put it down now because I'm 73 years old, and I've got one sister left, and she's been after me for a decade to say it out loud. So, here it is. Dale was 22. I was 17. He'd taken a seasonal job with the U.S. Forest Service out of the Gifford Pinchot National Forest, which in those days was still partly old growth, still had sections where the canopy was so dense you could walk through rain without getting wet. He was stationed out of the Wind River Ranger District, which sits in the southern Cascades in Washington state right up against the Oregon border. The Wind River Ranger District is a real place. You can find it on a map. It covers the drainage of the Wind River from the Columbia River Gorge, north toward the Indian Heaven Wilderness, and east toward the Dark Timber on the flanks of Mount Adams. In 1968, a lot of that ground had never been logged. Some of it still hasn't. Before I get into what happened to him, I want to tell you who he was, because the story doesn't mean anything if Dale is just a name to you. He was 5'11", brown hair that went lighter in the summer, big hands, the way all the Beringer men had big hands. Dale was the oldest of 4. I was the youngest. He was the kind of person who stopped to look at things. Not metaphorically. If there was an unusual rock in the road, he'd get out of the truck and pick it up. He had a field guide to Pacific Northwest birds that was so worn the binding had separated and he'd taped it back together twice. A Peterson guide to animal tracks he'd been working through since he was 14, pencil notes in the margins. He was genuinely interested in the world in a way that some people are and most people aren't, and the ones who are tend to end up in places that most people don't go. He'd worked 2 prior Forest Service seasons before 1968, both in the Gifford Pinchot country. He came home from the first different in a way I noticed but couldn't name. Not damaged. More like he'd been shown something that expanded his sense of what was possible. He talked about that country the way some people talk about a place they fell in love with. He went back in 1967 and came home with photographs, landscapes, and close-up shots of tracks and structures he'd found off-trail. I remember thinking the structures looked strange, but I didn't say so. I was 16 and preoccupied with other things. He applied for the 1968 season in January, got assigned to the Wind River Ranger District specifically, which he told our mother was exactly where he'd hoped. She asked why. He said the country was wilder up in there, fewer people. He wanted to spend a summer somewhere fewer people had been. Our mother packed him sandwiches for the drive north and told him to write, which he did. A postcard from Carson, Washington, and then the journal entries which were meant for his own record, but which became, after he was gone, the only communication any of us had from that last stretch of his life. His assignment was trail maintenance and some survey work. The Forest Service would put crews of 2 or 3 on what they called spike camps, small remote camps, sometimes nothing more than a canvas tent and a cook stove, and a radio that worked when it felt like it, deep enough into the backcountry that you didn't come down until your 2 weeks were up. Dale had done 2 rotations that summer, both without incident. 3rd rotation, he went up the week of August 12th with a partner named Roy Fitch. Roy came down 8 days later. Dale did not. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from and if you've had an encounter like this. Roy's account was disorganized and got more disorganized the more times he told it. The first time was to the ranger station when he came in alone on August 20th. He said Dale had gone off trail 2 days prior to investigate what Roy described as Some kind of structure, like stacked logs, but not right. Roy waited at camp. Dale didn't come back. Roy waited another day. Still nothing. He hiked out. That's what Roy said, and that's mostly what Roy kept saying for the rest of his life. Though if you pressed him on the structure, he'd go quiet in a way that made you feel like you'd asked the wrong question. Search and rescue went up. They found the spike camp intact, Dale's gear in his tent, his boots at the tent flap. His boots. I've thought about that for 56 years. His boots were there and he wasn't. His food was mostly uneaten. His journal was in his pack. Most of the journal was mundane. Work notes, supply tallies, mileage on the trails they were clearing, the kind of thing you write when you're keeping a record for the government. But the last 4 entries were different. I'll get to those. They searched for 11 days. They found no trace of Dale Beringer beyond the spike camp. No disturbance of the ground that the searchers could explain. No sign of injury, no blood, nothing. A 22-year-old man on a trail crew, in good physical condition, experienced in the backcountry, vanished from a spike camp in the Gifford Pinchot in the summer of 1968. The official report listed him as missing, presumed lost. There was talk of the river. There was talk of a fall off an unnamed ridgeline. There was no evidence for any of it. My father drove to Washington from our home in Roseburg, Oregon. He spent a week talking to rangers, talking to Roy Fitch, talking to anyone who would listen. He came back looking like someone had aged him 10 years. He didn't talk about what Roy Fitch had told him in private. My mother asked him once what Roy had said when no one else was around. My father said, "Something that doesn't make any sense." He never said more than that. Roy Fitch died in 1989. My father died in 1994. Whatever Roy told my father at that kitchen table, it went with both of them. I want to be honest about the timeline here so you understand what kind of story this is. I did not find my brother right away. I did not stumble into some clearing in 1969 and have a moment of reunion. What happened was slower and stranger, and took most of my adult life to piece together. What I'm telling you now is the accumulation of 56 years of going back to that country, of talking to people who knew things they weren't saying, of following threads that went cold and then went warm again decades later, and of one afternoon in September 2019, when I saw something on a slope above a creek in the Gifford Pinchot that rearranged everything I thought I knew about why my brother's boots were at the tent flap and the rest of him was gone. I need to back up and tell you about Dale's journal. The journal was a standard composition notebook, black and white marbled cover, the kind that cost 30 cents at any drug store. He'd been keeping field journals since he was in high school. I found 3 of them in my mother's closet when we cleaned out the house, from the 1966 and 1967 seasons, and they're in the same handwriting, the same careful observation style, though the 1966 journal is more basic, more the notes of someone still learning to see. By 1977, he was tracking things in more detail, specific dimensions of tracks, compass bearings, elevation estimates. The journals read like the practice runs for the 1968 journal, which reads like the work of someone who had arrived at what they were looking for. My mother kept it. When she died in 2007, it came to me. I've read it enough times that I could recite it. Most of the earlier entries are what you'd expect from a 22-year-old on a government trail crew in the backcountry. Work notes, supply tallies, a complaint about the cook stove, a description of a sunset that makes me think he should have been a writer instead of a trail crew hand. He had a gift for putting things down in a way that made you see what he saw. The description of the sunset on August 3rd is so specific. The way the light came through the big Douglas firs at a low angle, the color of the sky behind Mount Adams, the smell of the forest cooling down after a hot day, that I can close my eyes and be standing right where he was standing. Then about a week before he disappeared, the entries change. August 8th, 1968. Roy and I have been hearing something at night, coming from the northeast, up the drainage. Can't identify it. Not an elk bugling, wrong time of year and wrong sound. Not a bird in any field guide I've got. Roy thinks it's a bear acting funny. I don't think it's a bear. A bear doesn't produce sound with that kind of interval. Whatever it is, it pauses between vocalizations like it's listening for a response. August 10th, 1968. Found something today. A quarter-mile off the survey line, in a draw where the creek bends. Had to push through a lot of slide alder to get there. Structures. That's the only word I have. Sticks, maybe 5 or 6 feet high, arranged in pairs like A-frames, maybe 8 or 9 of them in a loose circle. Some of them had what looked like strips of bark woven through the uprights, almost like lattice work. The ground inside the circle was compressed, the duff packed down to bare dirt in places. Not like deer or elk had been lying there, like something had been sitting there repeatedly over a long period. The scale of it was wrong for most animals. The uprights on the nearest structure were locked into the ground with what looked like deliberate placement. You'd need hands for that. I didn't tell Roy. I don't know why I didn't. I went back in the afternoon alone and left my canteen lid on top of the nearest upright. When I came back just before dark, it was gone. The structure was otherwise undisturbed. Whatever took it did so without disturbing anything else. August 12th, 1968. I've been thinking about the orientation of the structures. I wrote down that they were in a circle, but that's not quite right. It's more like an arc or a horseshoe, and the open end of the horseshoe, faces northeast. I went back with the compass this morning and confirmed. Northeast is uphill, toward the main ridge. That's where the sounds come from at night. I don't know what that means, but I don't think it's coincidence. August 14th, 1968. Last night I heard something that wasn't an animal. I've been trying to think of another explanation, and I keep coming back to the same place, which is that I don't have one. It was dark, maybe 2 in the morning. Something was standing at the edge of the tree line, about 40 yards from the tent. The moon was up, but behind cloud, so I couldn't see clearly. What I could make out was a shape, large, standing upright, too tall for a man, too still for a bear. It was making a sound that I can't describe except to say it was low and modulated and had an internal structure, like it was made up of smaller sounds, arranged into something larger, like it was carrying a meaning, like language sounds when you hear it through a wall and can't make out the words, but you know it's speech rather than noise. I lay in my tent for about an hour listening. Roy was asleep and snoring and didn't wake up. Eventually I unzipped the tent door and looked out. The shape was gone. The sound was gone. The woods were just woods. But there were tracks in the soft mud at the edge of camp that weren't there when we made dinner. I measured one with my hand, stretching my fingers as wide as I could. Almost twice the span of my hand. I've got big hands, my mother always said. That's the last entry. August 14th. He disappeared sometime between the 14th and the 20th, when Roy came down alone. What I didn't tell you is that there were also entries between the ones I've quoted. Routine ones from August 9th and 11th that mostly cover work. A section of trail they'd cleared, a bridge timber that needed replacing, the radio check they did every evening at 6. But in the August 9th entry, there's one sentence that doesn't fit with the rest of the work notes. Went back to the draw after dinner. The ark is still there, nothing disturbed. But the area inside smells different than it did yesterday, warmer. Like something that was cold is now warm. And in the August 11th entry, buried between notes about a tool inventory and a weather observation, heard the sound again last night, closer. Roy slept through it. This morning his coffee cup was moved from where he'd left it on the rock by the fire. Moved about 6 feet and set down carefully. Not knocked over, set down. I've thought about that last detail more than almost anything else in the journal. A coffee cup moved 6 feet and set down carefully. Not knocked over by a raccoon or an animal, not rolling off a rock in the night, picked up and placed. In the dark, in a Forest Service spike camp on a ridge in the southern Cascades, while 2 men slept. Something had been inside the camp perimeter and had handled an object with enough care not to break it or spill what was left in it, and then left. Roy Fitch never mentioned this in any account I heard. I don't know if he even knew it had happened. Dale apparently chose not to tell him. I've read those 4 entries probably 500 times over 56 years. Every time I get to, like language sounds when you hear it through a wall, I get a feeling in my chest that I can't adequately describe. Something between grief and recognition. For a long time, I didn't know what I was recognizing. I figured it out later. I went back to the Wind River country for the first time. In 1971, I was 20, driving a truck with a canvas tent and 4 days' worth of food, and I hiked into the area where the spike camp had been. I found nothing. I got rained on for 3 days straight. The kind of cascade rain that comes in sideways and doesn't apologize. And came home. I went back in 1974 and 1979 and 1983. Each trip I got a little better at reading the country. I grew up hunting deer in the Umpqua River drainage south of Roseburg, so I knew how to move in the woods without announcing myself. But I was looking for something I couldn't name, and you can't find what you can't name. The 1971 trip was harder than I'm making it sound. I found the area where the spike camp had been. The ranger district had records, and a young ranger named Hollis, who'd been at the station in 1968, remembered the search. He took me to coffee at a diner in Stevenson. He said the search had bothered him for years, not because they hadn't found anything, but because of Roy Fitch's demeanor when he came in. He wasn't scared the way a person is scared when they've lost someone in the forest, Hollis said. He was scared the way a person is scared when they've seen something they don't have a category for. His eyes were wrong. He kept looking at the trees outside the window. I tracked Hollis down again in 1994. He said Roy had asked him something he hadn't put in the report. How long people had been going missing in the Wind River country. Roy said, "You should look at the records going back further. I think there's a pattern you're not seeing." That sent me to the Washington State Archives in Olympia in 1995, which I'll come back to. The 1974 trip taught me the terrain properly. The Wind River drainage northwest of the main fork had escaped the logging. Too steep, too wet, too far from any road. The ridgelines were close together, and the drainages between them narrow, funneling down to creek sections, with no road access within 3 miles. From the trailhead south of the ridge, you were on your own. In 1979, I spent a week in there and found the first evidence that made me take what I was doing seriously. Up in the tributary drainage above the maintained trail, 8 to 10 trees had been snapped at 8 to 12 feet off the ground. Not logged. The stumps were wrong for that, and no equipment could have reached this slope. The trees had been broken cleanly, the way a branch goes when you apply lateral force, not the shredded randomness of wind damage. The snapped tops were on the ground. A couple of them carried several yards from the break point. It took something of significant size and strength to snap a 6-inch diameter fir at 10 feet up. Whatever had done it had worked through multiple trees in the same area within a similar time frame. The breaks were fresh. The exposed wood hadn't weathered. I sat in that section for 2 hours. What I felt wasn't primarily fear. It was the feeling you get when you've been looking for something for a long time and find the first real sign of it. In 1983, I met a woman at a diner in Carson, Washington. Carson is a small, unincorporated community on the North Fork of the Wind River, about 12 miles east of the Columbia River Gorge. Population maybe 500. The kind of town where the post office doubles as the social center and everyone knows everyone else's business. The woman running the diner was named Elna Sue, Norwegian-American, maybe 65, had been there for 30 years with her husband, Dolph, who ran a small guide operation. I was eating lunch and she asked if I was a hunter. I said I was looking for a hiking area and mentioned the Wind River watershed generally. Nothing specific. She didn't say anything for a moment. She refilled my coffee. Then she said, "You're not the first one to come through here looking." I asked her what she meant. She said, "Some years we get 2 or 3. People looking for family, people looking for friends who went into the national forest and didn't come back. That country swallows people." She paused. "My husband, Dolph, says there are things up there that the government knows about and doesn't talk about. I always told him that was foolish talk. But we've been here 30 years and you hear things." I asked her what kinds of things. She set the coffee pot down and leaned on the counter. Sounds at night, knocking sounds, up on the ridge, like someone hitting a log with a bat, but far away and with a pattern to it. Animals that come to the edge of the clearing and just stand there looking at you without making a sound and then are gone. And we've had guests, hunters, backpackers, a wildlife biologist once who was doing work up in the Indian Heaven wilderness, who come down from up there looking wrong, not hurt, just changed, like they saw something they're not sure happened. I asked if anyone had ever said specifically what they'd seen. She was quiet for a moment. A man named Terrence Hodge. He guided hunters up in that drainage for 20 years, out of the Trout Creek drainage which connects to the Wind River system on the west side. He wouldn't talk about it with most people, but he told Dolph that he'd seen a family of them once. That's what he called it, a family. A big one and a smaller one, and what looked like young ones playing in a creek bed, splashing around the way children will. He said when the large one saw him, it didn't run. It just stopped what it was doing and looked at him. And then it made a sound that Terrence said was the saddest sound he'd ever heard anything make. Not threatening, something else. He said it made him want to apologize, except he didn't know what for. She straightened up. Terrence Hodge quit guiding in 1975, moved to eastern Washington. I don't know if he's still alive. He wasn't. I tracked down a son in Yakima in 1987, who told me his father had never discussed what happened on that last guiding season, beyond saying there were things in the southern Cascades that weren't in any book. He'd refused to return to the western slope. for any reason, for the rest of his life. Before Elna sent me on my way that afternoon, she told me one more thing. She'd been wiping down the counter, and she stopped and looked at me directly for the first time in the conversation. "You know what Dolph always said," she told me. "He said the reason people go missing up there isn't that something takes them against their will. He said it's that something offers them something and they choose to go." She picked up the coffee pot again. I always thought that was a strange thing to say. Now I'm less sure. I drove from Carson back down toward the Columbia River Gorge that evening, and I stopped at a pullout above the river and sat there for a while watching the water. It was September, the late afternoon light coming off the Columbia, in that flat golden way it does in early fall, the basalt walls of the gorge going dark above. I was 27 years old. I'd been doing this for 6 years, and I hadn't found anything yet that I could hold on to, and a 65-year-old Norwegian-American diner owner had just said something that was still working its way through me. Something offers them something, and they choose to go. Dale had chosen things his whole life that were harder than the alternatives. He could have worked in our father's hardware business in Roseburg, which is what our father wanted. He'd chosen the Forest Service instead. He could have taken an easier assignment, a posting closer to a road, less remote. He'd asked for the Wind River country specifically. He could have stayed in the tent when the sound woke him up. He'd gotten up and looked. The Washington State Archives work from 1995, going through incident reports from the Gifford Pinchot from 1920 to 1968, I found 23 cases of individuals who entered and didn't come back. Most had explanations, drownings, falls, but 7 were healthy, experienced people who simply stopped being there. No body, no gear beyond what was at the last known location. In 3 of those 7 cases, the filing ranger had noted something apparently worth recording: the missing person's footwear found at or near the last location, boots left behind. Cases spanning 1931, 1947, and 1958. Dale's boots were at the tent flap in 1968, 4 cases over 37 years in the same section of forest where a person's boots were present and the person was not. I know it means something. Quick thing before we get into it. A lot of what I've learned...
Quick thing before we get into it. I have a book coming out. It's called the Bigfoot Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. It's kind of my baby. So if you want to check it out, links down below. Now let's get you back to the video.
About something before I go further. At no point in those years was I operating from the assumption that Dale was still alive. I don't want to give you the impression that I was making pilgrimage after pilgrimage because I believed my brother was living in the forest somewhere. That's not what I was doing. I was a working man. I spent 30 years in the timber industry, first as a faller and later in mill management out of Cottage Grove, which has its own kind of irony given where I was looking. And I went back to that country the way some people go back to a place where someone they loved is buried. Because there was no grave. There was no answer. There was no explanation for why Dale's boots were at the tent flap with his feet not in them. I needed to understand what that meant, and the only way I knew how to look for that understanding was to go back to the ground. The timber industry gave me the money to keep going back, and the knowledge to understand what I was looking at when I got there. Fallers in the Pacific Northwest in the 70s and 80s worked in country that wasn't that different from what I was looking for Dale in. Steep, remote, old growth where it survived, second growth where it didn't. I knew how to read a watershed. I knew what a healthy Douglas fir drainage looked like and what a disturbed one looked like. I knew the difference between tracks made by black bears and tracks made by elk and tracks made by cougars, because knowing that difference is survival when you're working alone in falling timber. That knowledge was useful when I was looking for something else entirely. I also picked up, through the timber industry, a network of people who had spent time in remote country and had seen things they didn't talk about in the break room. Loggers and fallers and choker setters who worked in the back of beyond, and who, if you approached it right, would tell you what they'd seen in the tree lines at dusk or found in the slash piles in the morning. I didn't go looking for these conversations. They found me once I'd been in the industry long enough that people knew I was the guy who kept going back to the Wind River country, who was looking for something up there. In a small industry, in a small community, that kind of thing travels. In 1977, a faller named Bud Hesterhagen, who'd worked the Gifford Pinchot country for 15 years, told me, over coffee at a landing outside Randall, that he'd had what he called an experience on a ridge above the Wind River in 1972 that he'd never told anyone except his wife. He said he'd been working a unit alone one morning. His partner was out sick, and he'd heard something following him through the timber parallel to his line. Not on the skid roads, in the standing timber, moving through it the way something large and deliberate moves, branch after branch, giving way and then silence. Branch after branch, silence. He'd stopped working and listened. The movement stopped. He started working again. The movement started. This went on for about an hour. Then he heard a sound from maybe 80 yards uphill that he said, and he was embarrassed saying it. Sounded like someone saying his name. Not clearly, not like a person talking, but shaped like a name, shaped like the 2 syllables of Bud, coming from something that was not a person. He'd left the unit and driven to the ranger station and reported a possible human presence in the timber. The ranger had gone up and found nothing. Bud had requested a different unit for the rest of that contract and never worked that specific ridge again. He quit the industry entirely in 1979 and went to work in a hardware store in Chehalis. "I don't miss the money," he told me. "I miss the work. I don't miss what's in those woods." I asked him where on the ridge the experience had happened. He told me. The ridge he named was the one that ran along the northeast edge of the tributary drainage where I'd been finding tracks since 1996. I didn't know that in 1977. I figured it out 10 years later when I started mapping my own observations against conversations like his. I married twice. First wife, Connie, was a good woman who left in 1985. She said I was more present in the Cascades than I was in our house in Roseburg, and she wasn't wrong. Second wife, Patty, has known about this since our second date in 1988. She's heard every version of this story. She drove up to Wind River country with me twice before her knees made long approaches impossible, and she has never once suggested I let it go. That's the reason I married her. In 1991, I found Roy Fitch's brother, a man named Gerald, who was living in Kelso, Washington, about 50 miles southwest of the Wind River drainage. Roy had died 2 years earlier, of a stroke at 64. Gerald wasn't particularly eager to talk. He agreed to meet me at a tavern in Longview. He drank 3 beers while I had coffee. He said he didn't know what happened to Dale. I said I understood that. I asked him if Roy had ever said anything about that summer, about what he'd seen or heard before Dale disappeared. Gerald looked at his beer bottle for a while. Then he said Roy had told him something once in the mid-70s, after enough whiskey that Gerald wasn't sure how much of it was accurate. Roy had woken before dawn on the morning that turned out to be Dale's last day at camp. He'd woken to use the latrine, which was just a spot they'd designated down the hill from the tent. On the way back, he'd seen Dale standing at the tree line, just standing there, facing into the trees. Roy had almost called out to him, but something made him stop, and he could see at the edge of the trees facing Dale something that he described to Gerald as a very large person covered in reddish-brown hair, and it had a head that wasn't shaped like a person's head, and it was making sounds. Gerald said Roy used the word sounds carefully, not words, because he was clear they weren't words he recognized, but Dale was making sounds back. Like they were talking, Gerald said. Roy watched for 2 minutes, maybe 3. Then he went back to his tent, got into his sleeping bag, and pretended to be asleep. In the morning, Dale was gone. Roy had never told the search and rescue team this. He'd told them what he'd told everyone else. Dale went off trail to look at some structures and didn't come back. Gerald didn't know why Roy had made that choice, and said Roy never explained it. He just said, sometimes there's the story that makes sense and the story that happened, Gerald told me, and he'd figured out which one to tell. I sat with that for a long time after I left Longview. Roy Fitch had watched my brother exchange sounds with something at the edge of the forest at 5 in the morning, and he'd chosen to keep that to himself for the rest of his life. I don't judge him for it. He was 23 years old, and he'd seen something that his world had no category for. I'd probably have done the same. Gerald Fitch was not a talkative man. The conversation in that tavern in Longview was the longest I ever had with him. He called me once, about a year later, to say he'd found a few things of Roy's, some notebooks, some photographs from that 1968 season. And did I want them? I drove to Kelso. He met me at a diner, handed me a manila envelope, and said he hoped it was useful. Inside were 3 things, 2 photographs and a hand-drawn map. The photographs were taken with a cheap film camera, the kind that produced small square prints. One of them showed the Spike Camp, 2 canvas tents, a cook stove, a pile of tools, normal. The other showed a section of forest that I couldn't immediately place. Trees, undergrowth, poor light. But in the center of the frame, barely visible, there was something that Roy had apparently tried to photograph at a distance. A shape at the edge of a tree line, dark, upright, large. The image quality was too poor to make out any detail. But Roy had circled it in pen after the fact. He'd drawn a small circle around the dark shape in the tree line and written 2 words next to the circle, in handwriting I didn't recognize as Roy's style from what little I had to compare it to. Still there. The map was of the drainage, hand-drawn on a piece of notebook paper, compass rose in the corner, labeled in that same handwriting. The Spike Camp location was marked. The creek drainage was marked, and up the drainage, marked with an X and what appeared to be a date, August 12, 1968, was the location of the structures Dale had written about in his journal. The arc of A-frames, the horseshoe-shaped circle. Roy Fitch had drawn a map to the structures and kept it for 21 years before he died, and then his brother had found it and held it for 2 more years before giving it to me. I don't know what Roy thought he was doing with it. Maybe he thought someone would eventually need it. Maybe he thought he'd go back himself one day, and never could. The map was accurate enough that in 1992, the first time I went in after getting it, I found the location. The structures themselves were long gone. Decades of weather and decay had reduced them to ground-level debris. but the site was still visible if you knew what you were looking for. A slight depression in the earth at the center of the arc, the faint outline of where the uprights had been set. A darkness in the soil that suggested compressed organic material from years of use, and the compass bearing was right. The open end of the arc still faced northeast, because that's a direction, not a structure. North is north, whether or not anything is built to point at it. What Gerald told me changed how I approached those trips into the forest. Before 1991, I was looking for traces of Dale, for the site of the vanishing, for something I could bring home. After 1991, I was looking for what Dale had found. That's a different kind of looking, and it takes a different kind of patience. I started reading more seriously, not the tabloid material, but the field research. There were people in the Pacific Northwest doing systematic work in the 80s and 90s that most of the public never heard about. Methodical track documentation, photographic evidence, careful records of wood structures and other physical sign. The Gifford Pinchot showed up in these records with some regularity, not because dramatic encounters happened there specifically, but because the accumulation of smaller things pointed to it. Track finds along certain drainages, structures in areas too steep and too remote to attract casual visitors or hoaxers, consistent testimony from hunters and hikers that, when you got past the embarrassment, described the same basic thing Terence Hodge had described to Dolph Sue. In 1996, I found tracks in soft ground along a tributary of the Wind River, about 3 miles above the end of the maintained trail, 14 inches long, a stride of roughly 4.5 feet at what appeared to be a walking pace. The mid-tarsal break was clear in several prints. That's the way the foot flexes at the middle, the arch, which human feet don't do in the same way, and which bear tracks don't produce. These were biped tracks, 5 toes, each print showing clear toe spread, the heel narrower than the forefoot. They came from the northeast and crossed the creek, heading southwest, into steeper ground on the far side. I didn't follow them. I photographed them with a disposable camera. I didn't have a digital camera yet. And I sat by the creek for an hour, listening to the water and the birds and trying to feel what was there. What I remember most from that hour by the creek in 1996 is a quality of attention that I don't have a better word for, a sense that the forest was doing something more than being a forest. That sounds vague, and I apologize for that. What I mean is that there was a stillness in the upper canopy that I've learned, over enough trips into that country, corresponds to something. The birds weren't moving. The squirrels weren't moving. Even the creek seemed to go quieter than its volume warranted. If you've spent enough time in the backcountry, you know the difference between the forest being empty and the forest being watched. This was the second thing. I went back in 1997 as well, a trip I don't usually mention because nothing dramatic happened on it. And in retrospect, I think it was the most important trip of that decade. I was in that tributary drainage, the same one, and I came across a section of creek bank where the soil was soft from recent rain, and I found something I'd never found before and haven't found since. 2 sets of tracks, side by side. One set was large, the full adult size I'd been finding in that corridor. The other set was smaller, significantly smaller, maybe 8 or 9 inches, with the same basic morphology. The same 5-toed spread, the same narrower heel, the same evidence of the mid-tarsal break in the arch, but scaled down the way a child's foot is scaled down from an adult's. Same proportions, smaller size. They were moving in the same direction, the small ones beside and slightly behind the large ones. the way a child walks beside a parent. I stood there on that creek bank for a long time. What it meant was that there were young ones, offspring, that whatever was using this drainage wasn't a lone individual, but a family group, with generations in it. I took photographs. I marked the GPS coordinates. I sat on a rock upstream and tried to think clearly about what I was doing with my life and why I kept coming back to this ground. I didn't come up with answers that day. I came back anyway. I went back in 1999. This trip produced something I found more significant than the tracks, because of what it said about regularity and intention, about 2 miles from where I'd found the tracks, in 1996 on a hillside above the same creek drainage. I found a structure, a single construction, different from the circle of A-frames Dale had described in his journal. This was a lean-to arrangement, built against a standing dead Douglas fir. One end of a large branch was driven into the ground at an angle. The other end rested against the snag at about 8 feet up. Smaller branches were woven across this in a way that would take hands to accomplish, hands with real strength, because some of the woven pieces were thumb-thick and had been bent into place. At the base, where the main branch met the ground, there was a depression in the accumulated duff, the kind of depression that forms when something sits in the same spot repeatedly over a long period. The duff around it was compressed in a way that would take years to produce, and there was a smell. I want to be specific here because the smell has been reported so many times in so many encounters, and the descriptions are all over the place. What I smelled was not the overwhelming sulfurous wet animal musk that gets described in close encounter situations. What I smelled was subtler, a warm animal smell, recent, with something musky underneath, like the inside of a den, the way you'd smell a large dog that had been in a room an hour ago. Not threatening, just present. I stood there smelling it and understanding that something had been here very recently and had left before I arrived. I didn't touch the structure. I left. The year 2000 was when I came closest to stopping entirely. Our older sister, Beverly, had been diagnosed, and I spent most of that year in 2001 driving between Roseburg and Portland, where she was getting treatment, and the Cascades were just the direction on the map. In the fall of 2001, about 3 weeks after Beverly died, I drove north alone. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have gear for an overnight. I drove to the trailhead and sat in the parking lot for 40 minutes and then drove home. I don't count it as a trip. But I remember the parking lot, the mountains visible to the north, the particular quality of the October sky in the southern Cascades, that deep blue that you only get at elevation when the smoke from summer fires has finally cleared. The 2003 trip, I did go that year in May, earlier than usual, was the trip where I started to feel something shift in my understanding of what I was doing. I'd been at it for 32 years by then, on and off. I was 57. I wasn't going to find Dale. That ship had sailed in 1968, and I'd known it intellectually for decades, even if some part of me kept walking the same drainage, looking for him. What I was actually doing, I started to understand on the 2003 trip, was documenting a place, building a record of a specific section of forest over a long span of time. What sign was present, where it was concentrated, how it changed or didn't change year to year. That's what naturalists do. That's what wildlife biologists do. I wasn't trained and I didn't have credentials, but I had 32 years of trips and careful notes. And that's a data set of a kind, even if no institution would ever publish it. On the 2003 trip, I found the structure I'd found in 1999 had been replaced. Not exactly in the same location, but within 20 yards of it. a new construction against a different snag. Same basic method, same materials, different individual execution. As if the site was used and maintained, but not by an organism that placed identical constructions. As if it was used by a group, or by individuals whose constructions resembled each other, the way handwriting resembles itself within a family. Related, not identical. I photographed it extensively. I also did something I hadn't done before. I sat downwind of the structure for 4 hours, as still as I could manage, and waited. Nothing came. But in the 3rd hour, I heard something from above, uphill, that stopped me from moving for about 20 minutes. A sound that moved along the ridge parallel to my position. Footfalls, bipedal, heavy, with an interval between steps that was too long for a human walking pace and too regular for an animal moving through brush. Whatever it was, it knew I was there. It stayed on the ridge and moved along it and didn't come down. Eventually, the footfalls stopped and the forest returned to its normal register of sound and movement. I wrote everything in my notes and hiked out the next morning. I want to stop and say something about those years, the 1990s, the 2000s, because I think it's easy to make this sound like I was some kind of focused investigator with a clear plan and consistent methodology. I wasn't. There were years I didn't go at all. Years where I'd go for one day and turn back because the weather turned, or my knees hurt, or I just didn't have whatever it takes to walk into that country alone, with all of it. There were years where I went and found nothing and drove home, wondering if I'd lost my mind, if the whole thing was just a story I'd built out of grief to give Dale's disappearance a shape that wasn't just random bad luck in the wilderness. I had those doubts. I still have them, honestly, on certain nights. Grief does strange things to the way a person constructs meaning. What kept me going back was Dale's handwriting, the entries in his journal. Like language sounds when you hear it through a wall. That sentence, the specific observation of it, the way he was trying to find the right words for something that didn't have words yet. Dale was a careful observer. He wasn't given to exaggeration. His earlier journal entries, the mundane ones about trail work and supply lists, are written in the same careful, specific way. When he said it sounded like language, he meant it sounded like language, not that he was imagining things. In 2008, I retired from the mill. In the fall of 2009, I went back in with better equipment than I'd ever carried. A good digital camera, a handheld GPS, a voice recorder I used to make notes. I was 63, which isn't old exactly, but it was old enough to know I needed to be smarter about how I went in. The 2009 trip produced 2 things of note. The first was another set of tracks in the tributary drainage, the same drainage. I'd been finding sign in this corridor since 1996, which is 13 years, which meant something was using this ground consistently across more than a decade. The second thing was the wood knocks. 3rd night in, around 1 in the morning, I heard a sound from the ridgeline to the east. A hard impact, like a bat against a telephone pole. That's the description that comes up most often in accounts of this, and it's accurate. Sharp, resonant, clearly intentional. 3 fast knocks, a pause of maybe 6 seconds, 3 more. Then from the southwest, maybe a mile away, an answering sequence. 3 and 3. Back and forth, 4 exchanges in total, and then nothing. The entire communication, if that's what it was, lasted less than 3 minutes. I lay in my sleeping bag in the dark, and I thought about Dale writing. It was made up of smaller sounds, arranged into something larger, like it was carrying a meaning. and I thought about Roy Fitch on the way back from the latrine, stopping, watching, deciding not to call out. I went back in 2011, 2013, 2015. Each time I got a little deeper into the territory, a little better at reading the specific topography of that drainage. The 2013 trip was significant for one reason that I haven't talked about with many people. I was in the upper end of the drainage, above the tributary junction, and I found a place that stopped me. Cold. It was a hillside bench, a flat area maybe 50 yards across, protected from the worst of the weather by the ridge above. The trees there were old, real old growth, Douglas firs that would have been standing when Lewis and Clark came through the Columbia River country 2 centuries earlier, with trunks 6 and 7 feet across and canopies so high they were out of sight. The undergrowth was minimal, the way it gets under true old growth where the canopy shuts out the light and only oxalis and ferns survive at ground level. On this bench, there were structures, not one, like I'd found in 1999, multiple, 7 or 8 constructions of varying size, distributed across the bench in a way that had clear spatial logic. The larger ones were against the biggest trees. Smaller ones were in between, built on a reduced scale. All of them showed the same general construction method: upright elements, horizontal weavings, a base that had been adjusted to fit the ground contour, but varied in their specific form in the way that individual objects vary when they're made by hand rather than manufactured, not identical, related. The ground between them was packed, not just in the footpaths between structures, but in a broader way that said the whole bench was used regularly by more than 1 or 2 individuals. There was a clear area at the center of the bench, roughly circular, compressed down to bare mineral soil, that I didn't have a category for, not a fire circle. There was no ash, no charred material, just compacted ground in the shape of a gathering. Around the edges of this central area, at irregular intervals, were large flat stones, not native to the site. The hillside here was volcanic soil, and the stones were basalt river rock, which doesn't occur on this slope. They'd been carried here from somewhere below. They were positioned as seats, or as surfaces, like a table or a meeting ground. I walked through the entire bench without touching anything. I went back to the bench in 2014 and 3 more times between 2014 and 2016. Each time the site showed the same pattern, used consistently in ways visible in the compressed ground and maintained structures. Fresh sign each visit. A new depression in the duff at one construction, bark recently stripped from a tree. No human boot tracks, no litter, no flagging tape. No sign the Forest Service or any researcher had found this place. The 2014 visit I documented systematically. The structures ranged in apparent age, some partially collapsed and darkened from years of wet-dry cycling, others pale and tight, branches still with their spring. A decade, at minimum, of continuous use and maintenance. Probably longer. The central compacted circle showed bare mineral soil in the middle, the kind of exposure that takes years of repeated foot traffic to produce. Around its edge, the 7 river rock seats corresponded to sight lines rather than geometry, each positioned so the occupant had an unobstructed view of the center and the main approach directions. A seating arrangement for a group monitoring something in the middle or monitoring who came in. The rocks themselves had been carried from the creek bed below. 20 to 50 pounds each, up a slope no wheeled equipment could manage. 7 of them moved repeatedly, purposefully. That's not opportunistic, that's a project. I photographed everything I could, and when I walked back out, I had the specific feeling that I had walked through a place that people lived in, or that something like people lived in. Not an animal den, not a random assemblage of debris. A place with intention behind its arrangement, with the logic of habitation visible in every detail. In 2015, I'd been in contact for a couple of years with a researcher named Doreen Kask, who had spent 15 years doing systematic survey work in the Cascades and the Olympics, and had written up her findings in a way that was careful and methodical and almost entirely ignored by the mainstream. She'd documented track series in several drainages, had photographic evidence of structures, had audio recordings of vocalizations that she'd had analyzed by wildlife acousticians who couldn't match them to any known animal. We met in person for the first time at a diner in Packwood, Washington, which is on the south side of Mount Rainier, in November 2015. She was maybe 55, former biology teacher, the kind of person who takes very careful notes. I told her about Dale, about the journal, about what Gerald Fitch had told me. She listened without interrupting. When I was done, she was quiet for a while. Then she said something I've thought about ever since. She said the most consistent finding in areas of long-term documented activity was what she called generational territoriality. The same drainages, the same ridge lines, used by what appeared to be the same family groups across decades. Not individuals, families. She said the physical signs she was finding in certain areas bore a continuity across her 15 years of work that suggested permanent habitation, not seasonal transit. I asked her where her most consistent long-term site was. She said the Wind River drainage, northwest of the main fork. I got up and walked outside and stood in the parking lot for a few minutes before I came back in. There was one more thing she told me. She said that in 2003 she'd been in that drainage, in a section northwest of the main fork, and she'd had a close sighting. She hadn't reported it publicly because she was afraid of what it would do to her credibility with the researchers who took her systematic documentation work seriously. She said the animal, a large one, had been at the edge of a clearing, and when it became aware of her, instead of leaving it, had stayed. And it had made sounds that she described as an approximation of English, not words, not sentences, but sounds shaped like words, the way someone sounds when they're reading text aloud in a language that isn't theirs. They get the sounds approximately right, but the cadence is off. She said she'd heard something that sounded like careful, and something that sounded like wind, and something that sounded like a name, but she couldn't be certain. She hadn't been able to get closer. It moved into the trees after about a minute, and she didn't follow it. She said, "I haven't gone back to that specific location since 2003. Every time I plan to, I find a reason not to." I asked her why. She looked at her coffee cup. "Because I'm afraid of what it would mean if I confirmed it. I understand that now. I didn't, entirely, in 2015. In 2016, Patty's nephew, Cord, came with me. He was 30 years old, had done 2 tours in Iraq with the 2nd Infantry Division, was working in timber now, and had the particular combination of patience, physical capability, and comfort with discomfort that this kind of backcountry requires. I told him I was researching a long-term missing person case in that drainage, which was true enough. He didn't ask more than he needed to. We went in on a Thursday and came out on a Monday. We found tracks twice, both in the tributary drainage that had been producing signs since 1996. We found the ground nest-style depression in a hillside meadow, the kind of oval impression in compressed grass and duff that suggests something large returned to the same spot to rest, over and over, for years. We found a live alder bent at about 14 feet, not snapped, bent, in a curve that suggested sustained lateral pressure rather than a break event. Cord stood looking at it for a long time. He said, "Something bent that on purpose." I said, "I thought so." He said, "Something with a lot of force behind it." I agreed. On the last night, we heard vocalizations from multiple directions, overlapping, high and low in sequence, with an interior structure I'd been trying to describe to myself for years. Not elk, not cougar, not anything in the wildlife audio libraries I'd listened to in the years I was trying to identify what Dale might have heard that August. Cord sat up in his sleeping bag and looked at me in the dark. "What is that?" I said I didn't know exactly. He said, "That's not an elk." I agreed. He listened for another minute. "That's not any animal I've ever heard." I said no. He thought about it. "It sounds like communication." I said I thought so too. He nodded and lay back down, and we listened until it stopped. That was 2016, hip replacement in 2017. The Monday we came out, Cord and I stopped at a pullout on the highway, and I showed him everything I had. The photographs going back to 1996, the notes from 1971 to 2015, the map Roy Fitch had drawn, Dale's journal. He read for about an hour without saying much. When he was done, he sat looking out the windshield at the mountains for a while. Then he said, "What do you think happened to your brother?" I told him the truth, which was that I didn't know. I told him what Gerald Fitch had told me about what Roy had seen. Cord listened to that without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Roy chose to go back to sleep." I said yes. He said, "I think about that choice, what that takes." He was quiet again. When I was in Mosul in 2006, there were things that happened that I know happened because I was there and I remember them, but that I've never talked about because I don't have the right words. And I've thought about that a lot, about what it costs to have an experience that your language doesn't have the right words for. Roy paid that cost his whole life. He looked at me. "You're paying it too." I said yes. He said, "I think Dale stopped paying it." I drove a lot of the way home thinking about that. Dale stopped paying it. Maybe the right way to think about what happened in August 1968 is not as a disappearance, but as an arrival. Dale had been moving toward something for 2 years. The first season, the second season, the third rotation with its journal entries that read like a man walking, one step at a time, toward a threshold. He arrived at the threshold. He crossed it. I don't know if that reading makes it easier or harder, both, at different times, mostly both at the same time. On the way into Roseburg that evening, I stopped and bought a sandwich at a gas station and ate it in the parking lot, and I looked at the mountains to the north that you can see from the valley floor on a clear evening, and they looked the same as they always had, the same as they'd looked the evening before Dale drove north in 1968, the same, I suppose, as they'll look after I'm gone, and Cord is gone, and everyone who knew Dale Beringer is gone. The mountains don't know who's looking at them. The forest doesn't know whose brother walked into it. Only whatever lives up there keeps that record, and they're not telling us. Lenora's health scare in 2018. In the fall of 2019, when she was clear, I went back in alone. I was 73. Cord offered to come. I told him this one I needed to do alone, and I couldn't explain why, but I think I sensed something was different this time. I'd been in that country enough times to know when it felt like a preparation and when it felt like an arrival. 2 nights, in and out. The plan was to get to the area northwest of the fork where Doreen Cask had placed her 2003 sighting, and spend 2 full days just watching and listening. I wasn't expecting anything specific. I came around a bend in the creek drainage on the first afternoon, mid-September, the light coming through the old firs at that low autumn angle that makes everything look like it's being held up to a lamp. There was a clearing maybe 30 yards ahead, a natural opening where a big Douglas fir had come down decades ago, the snag still standing, the root ball exposed, the nurse log it had become covered in oxalis and moss. The light came through that opening and fell on a fallen fir that crossed the clearing, maybe 3 feet off the ground. And on that log, with its back to me, something was sitting. I stopped. I've been in the woods my whole life. I know the difference between a stump and a living thing. This was a living thing, large, seated, roughly the height of a very large man sitting on a log, maybe taller. Its back was covered in dark brownish-gray hair, longer at the shoulders, shorter on the spine, and I could see the individual hairs catching the light the way animal fur does, different from any fabric or any feather. The shoulders were wider than anything human by a margin I couldn't rationalize away. The head was set lower on the neck than a human head, the neck itself massive, and I could see even from the back the ridge along the top of the skull, the sagittal crest, which is the muscle attachment point for the jaw that you see on gorillas and other great apes, and which tells you something about jaw strength that you don't want to think too hard about. It was sitting in a posture that reminded me, immediately and without any effort, of a person sitting quietly, thinking, slightly hunched, resting, and in front of it, in the dirt of the clearing floor, were 2 smaller figures, much smaller, the size of human children, maybe 4 or 5 years old, though I wouldn't know what that corresponds to in their development. They were crouched in the dirt, knees up, looking at the ground between them, and the ground between them had been disturbed in a way that suggested marks had been made in it. The large one, the elder, I'm going to call it that because no other word fits, reached out one arm and drew something in the dirt with a single extended finger. Then it made a sound, low, deliberate, with a specific shape to it. One of the small ones looked at the marks and then made a sound back, trying to match it. The elder repeated the sound, slower. The small one tried again. The elder made a sound that I can only describe as affirmative, shorter, different in quality, like a response that said, yes, that's closer. I'm not claiming to have witnessed a language lesson with certainty. I'm describing what it looked like from 30 yards through partially obstructed undergrowth. What I'm telling you is what it looked like, and what it looked like was a lesson. The specific quality of patience in the elder's repetitions, the specific quality of effort in the small one's responses, the rhythmic structure of it. That's not random. That's the structure of instruction. I stood there without moving for what I think was about 10 minutes. My heart was doing something I'm not going to try to describe. The elder drew more marks, made more sounds. The small ones responded, tried, failed, tried again. The elder never got faster or louder. It just repeated. It waited. It responded to their attempts with what I can only call encouragement. Then one of the small ones looked directly at me. I don't know how long it had been aware of me. I'd approached from downwind, which was either luck or some part of my brain that knew the country well enough to choose the right angle. But awareness doesn't only come through smell. I should have known that better by then. The small one looked at me with amber-colored eyes, set wide in a face that was shorter and flatter than I expected, with a brow ridge that was visible even at this distance, and it made a sound. Not alarm, not fear. Something that sounded more like notification. Here is a thing, a person. He is there. The elder turned around. I have spent 50 years in the backcountry of the Pacific Northwest. I've encountered every large animal this region has, and a few it officially doesn't. I've been close to black bears and closer to one cougar than I want to think about. On the South Fork of the Mackenzie in 1978, an encounter that I still dream about occasionally. The elder turned around on the log and looked at me, and what I felt in that moment was something I have never felt in the presence of any animal. I've felt fear. I've felt wonder. I've felt the raw biological response to being very close to something larger and faster than you. This was not any of those things. Let me try to describe the elder's face more carefully, because I've been vague about it, and I don't want to be vague. I owe you the specific thing I saw, not the generalized impression of it. The face was not what I expected from 50 years of mental preparation for this moment. Bigfoot in the popular imagination has a flat, dark, ape-like face with small eyes and a heavy brow. What I saw was different in ways that matter. The brow ridge was pronounced. Yes, it shadowed the eyes from above in a way that changed how the light caught them. But the face itself had more structure than a great ape's face. There were cheekbones. The nose was broad and flat, but present in a way that differed from a gorilla or chimpanzee. The jaw was heavy, the chin minimal, but the whole lower face, the jaw, the mouth, the area around the eyes, had the kind of muscular expression I associate with thinking. Not the static arrangement of an animal's features, but the mobile, constantly adjusting expression of a face that reflects what's going on inside. The eyes were the hardest part. Amber, yes, darker than the small ones, with a pupil that was round rather than slit-shaped, like a primate's pupil rather than a cat's or a dog's. What I couldn't account for, and what I've spent 5 years trying to account for, was the quality of attention behind them. When the elder looked at me, it wasn't looking at me the way an animal looks at a person in the forest. That assessment, that calculation of threat and distance and escape route. Those eyes were doing something more complicated. They were looking at me the way you look at someone when you're trying to figure out how much they know and what they need and whether you're going to be able to communicate with them. The face was old. I could see that without knowing exactly what aging looked like in that species. The fur around the muzzle was lighter than on the rest of the body, and the eyes had the depth of eyes that have been open for a long time looking at things. The way my father's eyes looked when he came back from Washington in 1968. I don't know how long the elder had been there, in that specific clearing, in that section of forest. But I had the strong and specific impression of something that had been in the same place for many years, that had watched that section of forest through seasons and through the changes that decades bring, and that had carried whatever it carried through all of that without setting it down. The patience in those 15 seconds of eye contact was not the patience of someone waiting. It was the patience of someone who had been here the whole time. I felt recognized, not seen, not assessed, recognized. The way you recognize someone you know, the way your face does something involuntary when a person you've been thinking about walks into the room. It looked at me for what I estimate was 15 to 20 seconds. Its eyes were amber, like the small ones, but darker, with an opacity to them that suggested depth in a way I can't fully explain. It looked at me the way you look at someone you've been waiting for. Not surprised, not alarmed, something older than either of those things. Then it turned back to the small ones and made a quiet sound. Something short and soft. The small ones looked at me once more. One of them stayed looking a beat longer than the other, and then the whole group of them rose, smoothly, silently, in a way that produced almost no sound for the size they represented, and moved into the trees on the far side of the clearing. The elder was last. At the tree line, it stopped for a second and did not look back, and then it was gone. I sat down on the ground right where I was standing. I sat there for something over an hour. I know that because the light moved and I tracked it without meaning to. I need to tell you what the experience of those 10 minutes actually felt like, because I've glossed over it, and that's not honest. I've had a lifetime of experience with large, wild animals. I've been close to black bears 6 times in Oregon and Washington. I had the cougar encounter on the South Fork of the Mackenzie in 1978, where I came around a corner and it was on the ground in the trail 15 yards away. And I will tell you that what happened in my body in that moment, the adrenaline, the freeze response, the pure biological reckoning with an animal that could take you apart, was intense in a way that I have not experienced since, and do not need to experience again. I know what animal fear feels like. What I felt in that clearing watching the elder and the small ones was not that. There was no threat signal. Nothing in my body was interpreting what I was seeing as danger. What I was feeling was something harder to name. Something like the feeling you get when you walk into a room where something important is happening and you understand, before you consciously register the details, that the air in the room is charged with meaning, that what's happening here matters, that you are on the outside of something, looking in at it, and the right response is not to announce yourself, but to stay still and watch, and be grateful you're there to watch it. And underneath that, something personal, something that required all 56 years of looking to feel. I was in the presence of something that knew my brother's name. That's not a small thing. That's everything. That's the whole reason I was standing in that drainage at 73 years old with a bad hip and a day and a half of supplies in my pack. The whole reason I'd gone back 48 years in a row to a piece of forest in the southern Cascades on the Pacific side of a mountain range that the rest of the world mostly ignored. The small ones in front of that log were being taught letters that a young man from Roseburg, Oregon, had drawn in the dirt of a similar clearing in August 1968. They were learning them with the patience of students and the effort of children who are trying to get something right. And the elder, whatever it was and whatever it knew, was teaching with a patience that I recognized from my own life. From the patience you need when something is difficult and important, and the learner in front of you is trying their best. A Steller's jay arrived and left, and arrived again. A gray squirrel ran the length of a branch overhead and ignored me with the thoroughness that squirrels bring to ignoring things that aren't relevant to their current project. Eventually, the light started going golden, and I knew I had to move if I was going to make camp before dark. I walked to the fallen fir log. In the dirt in front of it, still clearly visible in the soft forest floor soil, were the marks the elder had been drawing. The foot traffic of the small ones had smudged some of them, but in the clearest section, preserved in the duff at the base of the log, 4 marks were unmistakable. A capital D formed in a single stroke, slightly lopsided. What was clearly an A, with a crossbar, an E, 3 horizontal lines off a vertical, and an L, D-A-L-E. I stood there looking at those letters until my legs started to shake, and then I sat down on the log because I didn't trust myself to stay upright, and I sat on that log in that clearing in the fading September light in the Gifford Pinchot National Forest, and I cried. Not the way you cry when something is over. The other way. The way you cry when something resolves. When a chord that's been suspended for 50 years finally finds its note. Before I walk you through what I know and don't know, I need to tell you about the walk back to camp that evening. It was about a mile from the clearing to where I'd set up my tent, on a flat above the creek. I've walked hundreds of miles in that country over 50 years, and I can do it mostly on autopilot now. The foot placement on the rocky sections, the lean into the slope changes, the way you keep your weight back on the descents. That evening I wasn't doing any of it on autopilot. My attention was entirely somewhere else. I was thinking about the moment when one of the small ones had looked at me before the elder turned. The small one's face had registered something when it saw me. Not fear, not threat response. Something that I would call, if I were describing a human child, recognition. The specific expression of a face that has been told about something and is now seeing it. Like a child who has been told about the ocean and is standing at the shore for the first time. That kind of face. The face of something confirming what it was told. I don't know what the elder had told them about people. I don't know what their knowledge of humans consisted of. But whatever it was, it included something that made a small one look at a 73-year-old man in a rain jacket standing in the undergrowth and register not fear, but recognition. And if Dale was in any way the source of what they knew about humans, if the letters in the dirt were his letters, his teaching carried forward, then what the small one may have been looking at was the first human it had seen that matched the description. Dark hair gone gray, big hands, someone who came back to the drainage the way Dale had come back to the draw with the structures day after day, to see if anything had changed. I got back to camp and sat at the tent door for a long time, before I went inside. The forest was going dark, the sky above the canopy turning that deep blue that comes just before the stars appear. The creek made its sound below me. An owl called from the ridge to the east, a barred owl, the right call for the country. I sat there and thought about Dale at 22, sitting outside his tent on the same kind of September evening, listening to the same creek, hearing the sound from the northeast that paused between vocalizations like it was listening for a response. And then I went inside, and I didn't sleep very much. I want to tell you what I know and what I don't know, because I've spent 5 years being precise about this in my own head, and the precision matters. I don't know if Dale Beringer is alive. He would be 78 years old, which is possible for a human life under ordinary circumstances. Whether these circumstances qualify as ordinary is a question I'm not qualified to answer. I don't know if he was alive in September 2019, or if he's alive now. I'm a 73-year-old retired timber manager from Roseburg, Oregon, not a scientist or a medical professional, and I'm not making claims I can't support. What I know is that those were letters in that dirt, capital letters, in English, D-A-L-E. Whatever drew them in front of 2 small ones who were trying to learn them knew what English letters were, knew how to form them, and was using them as instructional material. Those are facts I observed directly. What I also know is that Doreen Cask heard English-shaped sounds from an animal in that same drainage in 2003, and Dale Beringer, in August 1968, heard something at the tree line that he wrote sounded like language, heard it, wrote it down in a journal in a spike camp, and left before dawn on August 14th or 15th, and never came back. The through line there is either the most elaborate self-deception I've ever constructed, or it's something real. I came out of the forest that Friday morning and drove to Vancouver, Washington, where Patty was waiting at her sister's house. I walked into the kitchen. Patty looked at my face. She said, "You found something?" I said, "Yes." She sat down across the table from me and waited. I told her everything: the clearing, the elder and the small ones, the marks in the dirt, the letters. She listened without interrupting. When I was done, she was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Dale was good with kids." He was. That's exactly what he was. The kind of person who crouched down to talk to children instead of bending down. The kind who remembered their specific interests and asked about them next time. He was planning to start an education degree at Oregon State that fall. Teaching was what he was going to do with his life. He'd saved money from 2 seasons of trail crew work to pay for the first year. After I came out in 2019, I wrote it all down. Every trip since 1971. Every detail I could remember and every detail I had in notes. I gave a copy to Cord, to Lenora, to a lawyer Patty's family uses in Portland, to Doreen Kask. Doreen read it and called me. She was quiet for a long time on the phone. Then she said, "I should have gone back in 2003. I said, "Maybe." She said, "What do you think is happening?" I said I thought the elder was teaching, that whoever or whatever had come into their world decades ago had left something. The letters, a language, some beginning of communication, and that it was being preserved and passed on in the same way that any knowledge is passed on. Through repetition, through instruction, through the patience of someone who sits on a log with young ones and draws marks in the dirt until they get it. Doreen was quiet again. Then she said, "That would mean they remember him." Yes, that's what it would mean. I went back in 2021. Same route, same time of year. I found the clearing. The fallen fir was still there. 2 years of weather had taken the marks, of course. There was no new inscription in the dirt. I sat on the log for an hour and listened to the forest and felt the specific quality of that country that I've been feeling for 50 years. The held breath quality, the sense of being in a place that is more than a place. I left a canteen lid on the log before I started back. Old habit. Dale's habit, actually. He's the one who started it. The following morning, passing back through on my way out, the lid was gone. In 2021, before I left the clearing, I sat down in the dirt next to the fallen fir, in the same spot where the elder had been sitting. I wanted to understand the sight lines. From that position, the canopy opening was directly in front, the far wall of trees visible as individuals, and the approach where I'd come from was screened by a dense stand of young hemlock that would block direct view, while letting sound and smell arrive unobstructed. The elder had chosen that position deliberately, facing the light, back to the nurse log, positioned to know any approach before it was seen. That's not animal behavior. That's prudence. I sat there thinking about what it meant to hold a teaching the way that elder was holding it. A teaching from outside, from someone who came and stayed and gave something before he was gone, or became something else. A set of marks representing a way into the system that lets us say this happened and have it persist. DALE, a name. The first thing, maybe. Before any other word, a name. The specific individual who brought the knowledge, who sat on a log and drew marks in the dirt and waited to see if the young ones on the other side of an enormous gap would try to learn them. He was going to be a teacher. He saved up 2 seasons of Forest Service wages to pay for the degree. He never spent them, and the account sat with my mother for years before the bank finally closed it out. In the fall of 2022, before the fall on the trail, I drove to Portland, and spent 3 days at the Oregon State University Library, going through Indian agent reports from the Yakima and Cowlitz territories, going back to the late 19th century. Scattered across decades of those reports, there were references, not to Bigfoot. That name didn't exist until the 1950s. References to beings the agents recorded phonetically that the Yakima described as presences in the old forest that had existed before people. A report from 1907 had the most detail, drawn from a Cowlitz elder willing to talk. The elder described beings of significant size and intelligence that had coexisted with human communities for as long as anyone's memory extended. The elder used a phrase the agent rendered as the ones who remember, meaning these beings held a memory that exceeded human memory. They remembered the landscape before things that humans remembered as ancient, the drainages before the settler names were put on them. The ones who remember. I wrote that down, and I've thought about it since. And in a clearing in the Wind River drainage, an elder drawing 4 letters in the dirt for 2 small ones. Whatever Dale gave them, they remembered it. 56 years later, they were still teaching it. I went back in 2022 and took a fall on the approach trail that wasn't serious, but made it clear I was done doing this alone. Cord came with me in 2023. We didn't reach the clearing, but we found tracks in the tributary drainage again, 14.5 inches, 4.5 foot stride. After 27 years, that corridor was still being used. I'm not going back again. The body has made that clear. The hip I had replaced in 2017 is giving me trouble again, and the approach to that country doesn't forgive bodies that are giving trouble. The 5 years between September 2019 and now have been strange. I did what people do after significant experiences. I tried to integrate it. Some mornings it sat with me as something I'd finally been shown. Some nights it sat with me as the elaborate confabulation of a man who built a story around a loss that never had one. I go back and forth. I expect to keep going back and forth. What stabilized me was writing it all down. The winter of 2019 to 2020 at the kitchen table in Roseburg, while Patty watched her shows, going through every trip, every conversation, every piece of physical evidence, writing it out as much detail as I could. Not to convince anyone, just to have it exist somewhere outside my head where I could look at it. The way you write a thing down to find out if you believe it. When I read it back, what struck me was the consistency, not of the experiences, those varied enormously, but of the underlying pattern. The same drainage, the same corridor of sign, the family group structure implied by the 2 sets of tracks found in 1997, the bench in 2013. The evidence of something multi-generational occupying the same territory across the entire span of my looking. And at the end of it, an elder drawing letters in dirt that spelled a name. I've talked to 2 people in the years since 2019 who had experiences that paralleled mine in specific ways, not in the details. No one else's brother walked into the Gifford Pinchot and stayed, but in the structure of it. A woman in Bend who had spent 15 years looking for her husband, who had vanished from a hunting camp in the Cascade Range of Oregon in 1991. A man in Bellingham who had spent 30 years trying to understand what his grandfather, a Cowlitz man named Gilbert Slusher, had seen on a fishing trip in 1949 that had changed him permanently. Neither of them had answers, but talking to them confirmed something I'd been circling for years without landing on directly. The forest takes people, and it doesn't take them randomly, and what it takes them for might not be what we assume. Gilbert Slusher had told his grandson, before he died in 1981, that what he'd seen in 1949 had been terrifying at first, and then had stopped being terrifying and had become something else. He said the word recognition, the grandson told me. He said they recognized him. He didn't say he recognized them. He said they recognized him. I thought about the elder turning around on the log in September 2019 and looking at me with the specific quality of attention I'd felt as recognition. And I thought about a Cowlitz fisherman in 1949, 58 years before my own moment, feeling the same thing. We recognized him. We recognize you. We know who came before, and we know who kept coming back, and we know what was given to us, and we remember it. There are things I want to say before I close this out. I want to tell you something about the Gifford Pinchot specifically, because I think the place matters, and I don't want to be vague about it in a way that makes this sound like it could be anywhere. The Gifford Pinchot National Forest is about 1.3 million acres in the southern Cascades of Washington. It runs from the Columbia River Gorge north to the southern edge of Mount Rainier Country and east toward the Yakima Nation lands on the dry side of the mountains. The Wind River drainage is in the southwestern section. The Wind River itself is a real river, flows into the Columbia near the town of White Salmon. If you look at the landscape on a topographic map, you can see why the country northwest of the main fork is what it is. Steep, roadless, with a kind of elevation change that makes logging economically unattractive and recreational access limited to people who know what they're doing. There are no maintained trails in the specific section I've been describing. There are game trails and what I've come to think of as other trails, paths worn into the ground by regular foot traffic that don't appear on any Forest Service map. The Indian Heaven Wilderness is just north of where I've been working. The Trapper Creek Wilderness is to the west. Between them and the Wind River drainage is a section of roadless land that doesn't have a formal protected designation, but that has been effectively undisturbed for decades, partly because of the terrain, and partly, I've come to believe, because of deliberate policy. Doreen Kask told me in 2015 that she'd tried to get a research permit for the specific section I was working and had been told, twice, by the Forest Service's Wind River office that the area was not open to independent research, not closed for environmental reasons, not closed for safety reasons, just not open. She said the person she spoke with the second time, a woman who handled permitting, had said, "That section has been quiet for a long time, and we'd like to keep it that way." Doreen wasn't sure what to make of that. I have my own ideas. There is a long history in this part of the country of the indigenous nations knowing things that weren't written down, and that the non-native population has been slow to acknowledge. The Yakima Nation, whose traditional territory overlaps with the eastern edge of the Gifford Pinchot, has accounts of large bipedal beings in the Cascades that predate any European-American encounter by as far back as their oral tradition extends. The Cowlitz, whose territory covers the western drainage, have similar accounts. These aren't the cartoon Bigfoot stories that get circulated in popular culture. They're careful descriptions of beings with social structure, territorial behavior, and a relationship to the landscape that is qualitatively different from ordinary wildlife. Some of these accounts describe reciprocal arrangements, what you might call mutual acknowledgement. You don't go to certain places, certain things don't bother you. The boundary is respected on both sides. I don't know how much weight to give that framework, except to say that what I've seen in 50 years of going into that country is consistent with it in ways that are hard to dismiss. The Cowlitz accounts I found in those agent reports were consistent with what tribal members had shared publicly in more recent decades, not in tabloid contexts, but in academic and conservation contexts where the framing was respectful. There is a paper from a Pacific Northwest Tribal Council from 2011, available in the University of Washington Digital Archives, that addresses what the authors call cultural heritage obligations related to non-catalogued wildlife in traditional territories. The language is careful and legalistic because it has to be, but what it describes, between the lines of its formal structure, is an ongoing tribal obligation to maintain certain areas of the Cascade Range in a specific way, undisturbed, untracked, unresearched, not because of ecological concerns in the standard sense, but because of relationships with what the paper calls long-standing non-human communities that predate tribal human memory. The paper does not use the word Bigfoot. It does not use the word primate. It uses the phrase recognized presences and leaves it at that. I read that paper 4 times. The Wind River drainage northwest of the main fork falls within the traditional territory of the Cowlitz people. Whatever arrangement exists, whatever has existed for as long as anyone in that community can remember, it involves that section of forest. The Forest Service permit denial that Doreen Kask described, the woman who said the section had been quiet for a long time, and they'd like to keep it that way, might have been bureaucratic inertia, or it might have been something more specific. The Gifford Pinchot National Forest has a long and complicated relationship with tribal interests in that region. Not everything that governs land use in those mountains is written in federal regulations. I want to be careful here not to appropriate something that isn't mine to appropriate. The Cowlitz people and the Yakima people have their own relationships with what lives in those mountains, and those relationships are theirs. What I can say is that the consistency between what the oral traditions describe and what I've observed over 50 years in that drainage is not coincidental. When a tradition says that certain presences have lived in certain places longer than human memory, and the physical evidence in those places supports continuous occupation across at least the span of time I've been observing it, the tradition is not myth. It's description. There is one more thing I want to say about the place. The Indian Heaven Wilderness, just north of where I've been working, was established in 1984. The Trapper Creek Wilderness, to the west, was established in the same legislation. The section of roadless land between them and the Wind River drainage, the section I've been going into, was proposed for designation in the same package and removed from the final bill. I looked into why. The public record is thin, but there were comments filed by what's listed as interested community parties that were not timber companies, not environmental groups, not government agencies, requesting the section remain undisturbed. The names are organizational, not personal. The organizations don't appear in any other context I could find, but someone knew enough about that specific piece of forest to show up in a federal proceeding and argue it should be left alone. The people I've talked to over the years who've had serious extended contact with whatever is out there in those forests. Not the one-time startled encounter, but the kind of contact that builds over years. Almost all of them describe the same quality that I saw in that clearing: intelligence, patience, an awareness of the watcher that is not fear and is not aggression, but something closer to consideration, something deciding, each time, what to show and what not to show. Dale Beringer decided to show them his canteen lid. Then he went back to see if it was gone. I don't know what they showed him in return. I don't know what the exchange at the tree line on that last morning consisted of, or how long it had been building. I don't know what it takes, across whatever gap separates what we are from what they are, to build enough of a bridge that a young man follows you into the forest before dawn. What I think, and I hold this loosely, because I'm old enough to know how quickly conviction turns into certainty, and certainty turns into the thing that makes people stop seeing clearly, is that Dale found what he was looking for. He was 22, and curious in the way that leads people toward things rather than away. He'd left that canteen lid because he wanted to know if something would take it. He'd gone back to check. That's the whole story, in miniature. That's Dale. What I saw in that clearing in 2019, what I think those marks in the dirt were, is the record of a beginning. Someone sat with young ones in a forest clearing and drew letters in the dirt. 4 of them, in the order that spells a name. And then they got up and moved on, and the marks stayed until the weather took them. And somewhere in that country, in a drainage that still shows consistent sign 60 years later, something holds on to what was given to it, the way you hold on to anything that came from somewhere outside, and meant something when it arrived. D-A-L-E. My brother's name. Wherever he is, whatever he became in those 56 years in that country, that's what they remember. I think that has to be enough. I want to spend some time on the question that I've been circling for 56 years without landing on it directly, because I think it deserves a direct approach even if I don't have a satisfying answer. The question is whether Dale made a choice, not whether he was taken against his will. Roy's account makes it clear that wasn't what happened, or at least wasn't what Roy saw. The question is whether what happened was chosen, and what it would mean if it was. A 22-year-old man in a spike camp in the southern Cascades in August 1968 had heard something at the tree line for 6 days, had found structures and left an object on them and come back to find it taken, had written, carefully, about the sound and what it felt like to hear it, had been standing at the tree line before dawn, making sounds back, sounds that Roy Fitch watched for 2 to 3 minutes and described as a conversation, and then was gone. The simplest version of a choice. He was invited, and he said yes. I've thought about what that yes would have required him to understand, or not understand. He was 22. He was curious in a way that overrode caution. The kind of person who gets out of the truck to look at the unusual rock, who goes back to the drawer in the afternoon alone to see if the lid is still there. He didn't have the framework that I built over 50 years of research and reading and return trips. He had 6 days of experience and a field guide to animal tracks and a journal he was keeping for himself, not for anyone else. He had whatever the exchange at the tree line had communicated, which I can't know. What I know is this: he left his boots at the tent flap. That detail has meant different things to me at different points in 56 years. For a long time, it meant that something had come and taken him so suddenly that he hadn't time to put his boots on. That was the frightening interpretation, the one that belonged to the early years when the not knowing was still raw. Later it meant something he'd left behind deliberately, the way you leave things behind when you're moving from one life to another. You don't need boots where you're going, or you need different feet entirely. A biologist named Meredith Goff, who does field work on great ape behavior in the Pacific Northwest. Not officially, she works in a different institutional context and pursues this as a serious side inquiry, told me something that I've thought about a lot. She said that in the cases she'd studied where humans and what she called the Pacific Northwest hominids had extended contact, the pattern was consistent. The contact didn't go anywhere unless the human initiated it. You can't walk into the forest and find them. They have to decide to let you find them, or more precisely, to be there when you look. The canteen lid, she said when I described Dale's journal to her, was an initiation. He was saying, I know you're there and I'm not afraid, and here's something of mine. She paused. What I'd want to know is what they gave back before the final morning, what the exchange in the nights between the 8th and the 14th consisted of from their side. I've thought about that, too. The August 8th entry says they'd been hearing something for some time. The August 10th entry is the first time he went to the structures alone and left the lid. That evening it was gone. 3 days between the lid being taken and the morning Roy saw Dale at the tree line. 3 days of what? Of the thing coming closer to camp at night, of the sound shifting from the ridge to the tree line, of something picking up a coffee cup in the dark and setting it down carefully 6 feet away. 3 days of an exchange building toward something. And then the morning at the tree line, Roy watching, 2 to 3 minutes of something like a conversation, and Dale gone. What I can't get away from is this. He had the journal with him until the last morning. The journal was in the tent when search and rescue arrived, which means that either he left it behind deliberately, walked out of the tent, and left the journal he'd been keeping carefully for weeks, or he went to the tree line without it, planning to come back, and didn't come back, or came back and got what he was going back for. I've read the journal so many times that I can hear his voice in it. The careful, specific, curious voice of someone who is paying close attention to something and trying to put it down right. In the last entries, that voice is doing something specific. It's accelerating. The August 8th entry is careful and uncertain. The August 10th entry is careful and excited. The August 12th entry has the compass bearing, the specific measurement, I don't think it's coincidence. The August 14th entry is the longest of the 4 and has a quality that I can only describe as arrival. The sense of a person who has been moving toward something and can feel that the distance has closed, like it was carrying a meaning. He was 22, and he knew what he was hearing. What I've arrived at after 56 years of thinking about it, is that Dale understood something in those 6 days that most of us never understand, which is that there is more here than we were told. More in the forest, more in the world, more in the category of beings that are present on this planet and living full lives in places we are not looking. He found the edge of that more, and instead of backing away from it, he stepped toward it. He'd always stepped toward things rather than away. That was the essential fact of who he was. I don't grieve that choice anymore. I grieved it for 20 years, and then something shifted, and I stopped. What I have instead is something that doesn't have a name, but that I think of as a particular kind of respect for the person he was and the choice he made, and whatever his life has been in the half-century since, in whatever form, in whatever country, in whatever version of himself he is now, or was, or became. One more thing. My sister, Lenora, read a version of this before I put it out. She was 12 in 1968, and she worshipped Dale the way younger sisters worship older brothers who are kind to them. She said to me, after she'd read it, I think he found what he was looking for, which is more than most people get. She said it knowing it would wreck me which it did. That's what sisters do. Before I get to Cord's question, I want to tell you about Patty's role in this, because I've mentioned her throughout, but I haven't done her justice. Patty Reardon, she kept her name, is from Medford originally. We met in 1988 at a mill safety training in Eugene. She was in HR at a different company and was attending for certification purposes. She had dark hair and the particular quality of attention of someone who listens before she responds, which is rarer than it sounds. I told her about Dale on the second date because I'd learned from the first marriage that if you don't tell people about Dale early, you end up having to tell them later in a context that makes it worse. I said, "My brother went missing in 1968 in the Cascades, and I haven't found out what happened, and I go back there every year or two looking." She said, "What do you think happened to him?" I told her what I knew, which in 1988 was less than I know now, but included the journal and Roy Fitch's silence and the family's years of not knowing. She sat with that for a while and then said, "Do you need to find him, or do you need to find out what happened?" I said I didn't know the difference. She said there might be one. She was right that there was a difference, and figuring out which one I needed took another 15 years. What I needed was to find out what happened. Not to find him, not to recover him, not to bring anything back, to understand. And that's a different project, and it has a different kind of ending, which is not an ending at all, but a reaching of sufficient understanding that you can live with the remainder of what you don't know. Patty came with me in 1993 and in 2001. In 1993, we went in for 3 days, and she noticed things I missed. A bark rub on a hemlock at a height that required a tall animal. Skunk cabbage eaten systematically in a way that wasn't typical wildlife behavior. A depression behind a nurse log shaped like something that lay down there regularly. "Like a bed," she said. "They use the same spots, don't they?" She'd been listening to me describe this country for 5 years and had understood something that took me 2 decades to understand clearly. They are residential. They live there. The 2001 trip came after Beverly died. I'd said I wanted to go alone, and Patty had said she was coming. We went in together and found little. But the trip wasn't about finding anything. Patty held my hand at the creek crossing on the way out, and we drove home through the gorge in the evening light and listened to the radio. She drove to Vancouver in 2019 to wait for me to come out, because she was not willing to be somewhere else when I did. She'd driven up separately and was staying with her sister, who had been briefed on the basics of what I was doing, but not the specifics. When I walked into the kitchen that Friday morning and she looked at my face, what I saw in her face, in return, was not surprise. It was the face of someone who has been waiting for the specific thing that just happened and is now in the moment of receiving it. I told her about the clearing and the letters, and she cried. Not the way I'd cried in the clearing, but differently, in the way that someone cries when something they've held for another person is finally resolved. She'd been holding it too, for 31 years. The letters in the dirt were not just mine. Cord asked me once in 2023 on our last trip in what I was going to do with all of it. The journals, the photographs, the GPS coordinates, the account of what I'd seen in 2019. He asked it the way young people sometimes ask questions that older people have already run through to their end points and come back from. I told him I was going to say it out loud, which I'm doing now. And beyond that, nothing. I'm not going to file a report with the Forest Service. I'm not going to contact a university researcher or a wildlife agency or anyone who has the power to send people in there with equipment and agendas and the confidence that discovery requires. I'm not going to do that because I sat on that log in September 2019, and I watched an elder teach two small ones how to form letters in the dirt. And the right response to witnessing something private and important is not to go home and tell the government about it. Doreen Cask said something to me after she read my account. She said, "You know what strikes me? In every serious long-term encounter situation I've documented, the moment where the person really has to make a decision is the moment after. What you do with what you've seen. And the people who've been in this long enough, who've developed something like a relationship with a territory over years, they always describe the same feeling at that moment, like they've been given something, and the only right response to being given something is to protect it." I think she's right. I think whatever Dale gave them in 1968, whatever those 56 years of contact built on that original exchange, belongs to them now. The letters, the name. Whatever else was passed in whatever conversations happened in whatever clearing on whatever morning in however many years of being in that country together, that belongs to them. There's one more thing I want to include because it changed how I understood what I'd seen. After 2019, I described to a primatologist through Doreen Cask's network, without identifying context, a hypothetical, a great ape species of significantly greater cognitive capacity than known great apes that had been in extended contact with a human. What might that contact produce? What might be retained and transmitted? She said the thing we consistently underestimate in great ape cognition isn't the capacity for learning, but the motivation. In captivity, apes learn human-associated behaviors because the environment incentivizes it. In the wild, the motivation isn't there. But she said, if you had an extended relationship between a great ape and a human, in the ape's territory, on the ape's terms, you might produce a fundamentally different kind of learning, not incentivized by captivity, but chosen, because the relationship itself was the motivation. And that kind of learning, she said, she would expect to be retained and transmitted in ways that captive learned behaviors typically aren't. Because it would be embedded in social context. It would be part of a story. She didn't know she was describing what I'd seen in the clearing. She was describing it exactly. All I've done is say that it happened. There's a detail I haven't mentioned. In Roy Fitch's photograph, the one Gerald gave me in the envelope in 1991, the one with the dark shape circled in ink in the tree line, and the words still there written next to it. I've had that photograph for 33 years. I've kept it in a manila envelope in a filing cabinet in the office at the back of our house in Roseburg. I've taken it out and looked at it more times than I can count. The image is grainy, and the dark shape in the tree line is barely distinguishable from the shadows around it. But I've looked at it long enough and closely enough that I can see what Roy saw when he circled it and wrote those two words. In the center of the dark shape, barely visible in the grain of the photograph, there are 2 points that catch the light differently than the surrounding dark. 2 points, close together, at a height that is consistent with eyes at roughly 7 feet off the ground. Roy had circled the whole shape, but those 2 points are the center of it. Those are what he was looking at. That's what he took the photograph of, and then he'd written still there. He'd taken the photograph at some point during the 2 weeks. He'd seen the shape before, known it was there, gone and gotten the camera. And it had been there when he went back to photograph it. Still there. After everything that had happened, after 6 days of sounds and structures and a coffee cup, moved 6 feet in the night, and Dale at the tree line in the early morning. After all of it, Roy had taken one photograph and written 2 words and kept them for the rest of his life. Still there. I think about those 2 words, what it meant that he used the present tense. Not was there. Still there. Dale Beringer. Born January 3rd, 1946 in Roseburg, Oregon, wanted to be a teacher. Left a canteen lid on a stick structure in the southern Cascades on a Tuesday afternoon in August of 1968 and went back before dark to see if it was gone. It was. That's where the story starts. I know where it's been since. I know where part of it still is, in a clearing in the southern Cascades, in a piece of old-growth forest that belongs to everyone and no one, where something old and patient sits on a fallen log with the young ones and teaches them the marks that a 22-year-old from Oregon left behind. I've been asked, in the years since 2019, whether I feel like I got closure. People who care about me asking it, not strangers. Lenora asked it. Cord asked it, once in his direct way. Patty has never asked it because she already knows the answer. Closure is the wrong idea for something like this. Closure implies a door that was open and is now shut. What I have is more like a horizon that moved. I can see further into it than I could before. The remaining distance is still there. I'm still looking. But what's in the distance is different now than it was, because I've seen enough to know its shape, if not its full dimension. A clearing in old-growth timber, a fallen fir, an elder and 2 small ones, 4 letters in the dirt. That's enough. It's not